Tonight's story is an original mystery inspired by documented wilderness disappearances, search and rescue investigations, and accounts from families of missing children. While the investigative procedures reflect real-world practices, the characters, locations, and events are fictional. My son disappeared before lunch. 3 days later, they found him alive. The impossible part wasn't that he survived. The impossible part was where they found him. My name is Robert Voss. I'm 51 years old now. I was 48 when it happened. I teach geography at a community college in eastern Washington, which means I understand terrain. I understand topographic maps and elevation gradients and what 12 miles of wilderness actually looks like when you lay it out on paper. I understand exactly why what happened to my son is impossible. That understanding has not helped me. His name is Marcus. Marcus David Voss. He was 7 years old on the day he disappeared. He had dark hair and his mother's eyes and a gap between his front teeth he was enormously proud of because it meant the tooth fairy had come twice in 1 month. He was curious in the particular way 7-year-olds are curious, relentlessly, without filter, following every question to its next question until you ran out of answers. He is 15 now. He is healthy. He is here. I want to say that clearly at the start, because this story is hard to tell, and I need you to know that he is here. That matters more than any of the rest of it. But I also need to tell the rest of it, because the rest of it has been living in me for 8 years, and Marcus has asked me to write it down, and I owe him that. The Granite Divide Wilderness in central Idaho is one of the largest wilderness areas in the contiguous United States. Nearly 1.4 million acres of roadless terrain, river drainages, granite ridgelines, old-growth forest, elevation ranging from 2,000 feet in the river bottoms to nearly 11,000 at the high peaks. It is remote in a way that most people in this country have not experienced. There are sections of it where the nearest road is more than 30 miles in any direction. We were not in those sections. We were at the manageable edge of the wilderness, accessible by a forest road and a moderate trailhead. Our campsite was 4.2 miles from the trailhead, at an established site above a river drainage, a trip we had done before. My wife, Catherine, and I had camped in this general area 3 times. We knew the trail. We knew the campsite. Marcus had done the hike twice, the previous 2 summers. He knew to stay in camp. He knew the protocol if he got separated. Stop, call out, stay put. We had practiced it. He was good at it. This is the part that experienced parents of lost children all say, and it is all true, and it doesn't matter. The children still disappear. Marcus had been 7 for 3 weeks. We'd done these trips every summer since he was 4. Catherine had started bringing him on day hikes before he could name what he was seeing, pointing at things and saying the words, osprey, basalt, snowmelt, deadfall. By the time he was 5, he was correcting her on bird identification. By 6, he had a specific interest in things that lived under rocks, not just salamanders, but millipedes, beetles, the specific architecture of ant colonies. He would spend 20 minutes examining a square foot of forest floor with the focus of a scientist. He was 7, and he was curious, and he was never, in any of the years we had camped with him, a child who wandered. He understood boundaries. He had the kind of temperament that respects defined limits because he could see the logic in them. If we said stay in camp, he stayed in camp. If we said, "Stay on the trail," he stayed on the trail. He stayed until he didn't. I've thought a lot about whether there was a moment on Friday evening or Saturday morning where something was different about him. Something I missed. A quality of attention toward the tree line. A restlessness I didn't read correctly. I've been over those hours so many times that the memory has become unreliable, polished by repetition into something too smooth to trust. What I remember is ordinary. Marcus reading his field guide. Marcus eating breakfast with good appetite. Marcus crouched in the grass at the camp edge, focused and still, the way he always was when he was watching something. Nothing different. Nothing I would have done differently. That's the part that has no good place to go. We arrived at camp on a Friday evening in late July. The hike in was warm, and Marcus complained about his pack for the first 2 miles, and then forgot about it because he found a salamander under a rock near a creek crossing and spent 20 minutes watching it before Catherine persuaded him to move on. He talked about the salamander for the rest of the hike. That evening, camp set up, dinner done. Marcus sitting in his small camp chair with a headlamp reading the field guide he'd brought. He had been working through a section on amphibians. He told me that salamanders could regenerate lost limbs, which he found spectacular. I told him I agreed. He said, "Do you think there are more under the rocks by the creek?" I said, "Probably." He said, "Can we look tomorrow?" I said, "Yes. Tomorrow morning, before the day hike, we would look for salamanders." He turned back to his field guide. Catherine and I sat and watched the fire burn down. That was Friday. The last ordinary evening. Saturday morning. Catherine was making oatmeal. I was repacking the day packs for the hike we'd planned. A loop trail that ran north along the ridgeline before descending back to camp, about 8 miles, manageable for Marcus if we took it slow. Marcus was at the edge of camp, crouched over something in the grass. He'd been there for about 10 minutes. I'd been watching him peripherally, the way you track a child's position without looking directly. I turned to fit the water filter into my pack. I heard Catherine call his name. I turned back. The grass at the camp edge was empty. Marcus was gone. I want to be careful about the timeline because the timeline is important. From the moment Catherine called his name to the moment I reached the camp edge was approximately 15 seconds. I have replayed this so many times that the number has become both exact and suspect. I know it was fast. I know it was not enough time for a child to be out of sight if he had walked in a normal direction, and I know the grass was empty. We called his name. We checked the tent, the tree line, the path to the latrine. We split and covered the camp perimeter in opposite directions. Nothing. We called louder. We kept calling. The forest gave us the creek and the wind, and our own voices. Nothing else. 19 minutes after he disappeared, Catherine triggered our satellite communicator. Not because we were certain something was wrong. We were still in the callin' and hopin' phase. But because 19 minutes without a response from a 7-year-old who knew the protocol was past the threshold. We made the right call. I've thought a lot about whether we made the right call in those 19 minutes. Whether we searched correctly, covered the right ground, listened in the right directions. I've gone over it with SAR coordinators and tracking specialists and a wilderness search consultant who reviewed the case 2 years later. All of them said we did everything correctly, None of that helped either. The first search team reached the trailhead at 2:40 p.m. They were at our campsite by 4:15. By the time they arrived, Marcus had been gone for approximately 5 hours. The lead coordinator was a man named Steve Arkle. 17 years of wilderness, SAR in Idaho and Montana. He set up his command structure efficiently and interviewed us both within the first 30 minutes. The questions were systematic, and I knew what most of them were assessing. Were we telling the truth? Was the child actually missing? Was there reason to suspect something other than a child who had wandered? We answered everything. At the end, Steve said, "The window is still good. Kids this age don't typically move fast. We're going to start at camp and work outward." He was right about the search methodology. He was wrong about Marcus having moved like a typical lost child. No one knew that yet. The dogs arrived at 6 p.m., 2 tracking dogs and their handlers, given Marcus's fleece from his sleeping bag, worn the previous night. Strong scent. Both dogs worked from the camp edge where he had been crouching in the grass. They moved north. 30 yards into the timber, the first dog stopped and worked the area. The handler let him time to find the continuing trail. He couldn't. The second dog tried from the same point. Same result. The scent moved north from camp and ended in the timber 30 yards out. The handlers tried different approaches, different angles into the same area. Fresh starts from the camp chair. Nothing produced a continuing trail. Marcus's scent ended 30 yards from where he'd been crouching, in the middle of the forest. Where did it go? I watched the dog work happen in real time. The lead handler, Risa, let the first dog work for over 20 minutes. I stood at the edge of the area she'd asked me to stay behind, and I watched the dog move in the specific pattern dogs use when they're searching. Purposeful, nose down, reading ground, and air in alternating sweeps. The dog knew the scent. He'd established it clearly from the sleeping bag, had moved from the tent to the camp edge with confidence, had turned north without hesitation. And then, at the 30-yard mark, the confidence ended, not gradually. Not a slow decrease as the scent weakened with distance. A stop. The dog worked back and forth across a section of ground about 10 yards wide and kept returning to the same point. He wasn't casting forward for a continuing trail. He was circling, the way a dog circles when it knows the scent is there and cannot understand why there is nowhere for it to go. Risa crouched and watched him. She said nothing. She called him back and let him rest. The second dog showed the same behavior. Shorter, because the second handler could read from the dog's early movements that he was confirming rather than finding something new. She said to Steve Arkle, not to me, "It's not a creek crossing. It's not rock. There's nothing here that explains this." She said, "The scent is present. It simply doesn't go anywhere from this point." Steve said, "What's your read?" She said, "My read is that from this point forward, I can't help you with the dogs. We'll try other approaches, but I want you to know, this isn't a scent condition problem. I've seen scent conditions fail. This is different." Steve didn't respond to that. He turned and walked back toward the command area. I stayed at the 30-yard mark. I looked at the ground. Ordinary forest duff, pine needles, decomposing matter, a few exposed roots. Nothing remarkable. My son had stood here, or near here, and something had happened. I don't know what. That night I did not sleep. Catherine and I sat at the command post the SAR team had established at the trailhead and waited. The search teams were working in shifts. The thermal helicopter made 2 passes after dark. Nothing. I sat in the car at some point. I don't remember making the decision to sit in the car. I was there, and then I was in the car, staring at the forest at the end of the access road. And the forest was dark and large and completely indifferent. Marcus was in there somewhere. Probably. Or he wasn't. And I didn't know what that meant. Day 2. By morning, the search had 93 people, volunteers from 3 counties, 2 more dog teams, a fixed-wing aircraft doing grid work. A drone team from a regional university arrived mid-morning with thermal-capable equipment and began systematic coverage of the drainages north and east of camp. Steve Arkell briefed me at 8 a.m. He was honest. He said the dog's behavior at the 30-yard mark was unusual. He said they were working the assumption that Marcus had moved through terrain that disrupted the scent, rocky sections, a creek crossing, anything that would explain the drop. He said they were covering the terrain north of camp at maximum density. I asked, "Is there anything that suggests he went a different direction?" He said, "No. Everything we have points north." Everything pointed north. Marcus was found 62 hours later, 12.5 miles south. There is no explanation for that. The second day of the search produced 2 developments I haven't fully described. The first was the thermal drone coverage. The team flew systematic grid patterns over the drainage system north of camp, the direction the dogs had initially indicated. The equipment was capable of detecting a child-sized heat signature through moderate canopy. The conditions were favorable: cool morning air, clear sky. They covered 42 square miles in 8 hours. Nothing. The lead operator told Steve Arkell that the coverage was as complete as the equipment allowed. He said, "If he's in that drainage, in that terrain, and he's alive, we would have found him." He was in the opposite drainage, 12.5 miles south, and the drones never looked there because no evidence had pointed south. The second development was a witness. A solo backpacker named Gerald Torino had been camped approximately 2 miles south of our campsite on Saturday night. He came out to the trailhead on Sunday morning, saw the command post, and asked what was happening. When the ranger told him, he volunteered something. He said that on Saturday evening, at around 6 p.m., he had seen something on the trail above his camp. He said he had seen a child, walking south, on the trail, moving at a steady pace, alone as far as he could tell. The child had not acknowledged him, had not looked toward his camp, had kept walking. He described a small figure, dark hair, wearing a light blue shirt. Marcus had been wearing a light blue shirt. The investigators debriefed Gerald Torino for 2 hours. He was clear, specific, and consistent. He had not been alarmed at the time because he had assumed the child was with a group ahead or behind. He had watched the child walk out of sight and thought nothing more of it. The location where he saw the child was 2 miles south of our campsite. At 6 p.m. on Saturday, Marcus had been gone for approximately 8 hours, and Gerald Torino's account was the only evidence, in the entire case, of Marcus moving south, away from where every search team was working, away from where the dogs had pointed, directly away from where 2 helicopters and 42 square miles of drone coverage were being applied. The investigators tried to construct a scenario where Marcus had somehow reached the trail 2 miles south and been walking alone. The problem was the terrain between the campsite and that point on the trail. To reach that location, Marcus would have had to cross a section of drainage that search teams had covered on day 1. He had not been there on day 1. Gerald Torino's account was verified, documented, and filed. It explained nothing. It deepened everything. If that was Marcus at 6 p.m. Saturday, 2 miles south and moving, then something had moved him through a covered search area without being seen, and then continued moving him another 10.5 miles south over the next 40 hours, to a creek, where he sat on a flat rock and waited. The tracking specialist's name was Diane Chu. She was brought in on day 2, flown in from Boise, and she spent the better part of 48 hours in the field before she said anything to me directly. When she did, she sat across from me at a folding table at the command post. She said, "I want to tell you what the ground is telling me, because I think you deserve to know." I said, "Please." She said, "There is no trail leaving the camp in any direction that I can attribute to your son. Not north, not south, not east or west. The ground around the campsite in every direction has been examined. The scent work points north and ends. The soil work shows no compression pattern consistent with a child's movement in any sustained direction." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means that either the physical evidence of his movement was obscured in a way I can't identify, or he moved through terrain in a manner inconsistent with what I'd expect from a 7-year-old under any circumstances." She paused. She said, "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've tracked children in every condition you can imagine. The terrain here is difficult, but it is not so unusual that it would erase a child's trail completely in every direction." I said, "You're telling me you can't explain it?" She said, "Yes. That's what I'm telling you." She went back into the field. 2 days later, Marcus was found 12.5 miles south. Diane Chu drove south when she heard the location. She called me that evening. She said, "There is no terrain pathway between your campsite and the recovery location that a 7-year-old could cover in 72 hours under his own power. I need you to understand that. Not difficult. Not unlikely. Not without adequate food and water. Physically impossible. The terrain between those 2 points includes a ridgeline at 8,900 feet, a river crossing that requires an adult-level swimming ability, and approximately 40 miles of actual ground distance if you follow any navigable route." I said, "He was found 12.5 miles from camp." She said, "In a straight line. The straight line goes through terrain that is not passable." I said, "Then how did he get there?" She said, "I don't know." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I've been trying to answer that question. I cannot." The recovery happened on Monday morning. A pair of backcountry hunters working a drainage 12.5 miles south of our campsite found Marcus sitting on a flat rock at the edge of a creek. He was alive. He was wearing his camp clothes, the same clothes he'd been wearing when he disappeared. He was dehydrated, but not severely. He had no significant injuries. His shoes were on his feet. The hunters said he was calm, not distressed, not in shock. He was sitting on the rock with his feet in the creek, and he looked up when they approached and said hello. They called him over. He walked to them normally. He said his name was Marcus. He said, "I've been waiting." They asked waiting for what. he said. For someone to come. They asked where he'd come from. He pointed in a direction and said, "From the camp." The camp was 12.5 miles away through terrain that 2 separate wilderness experts later assessed as impassable for a 7-year-old. He was airlifted to a hospital. Catherine and I drove. I don't remember the drive. I remember walking into the hospital room and seeing him sitting up in bed, eating crackers, and looking at me with his mother's eyes. I sat down next to him and held on. He said, "Dad, I found a salamander." The hunters who found Marcus were named Dale Prescott and his nephew Kevin. Dale gave a statement to investigators, and I spoke with him once, about 3 months after the recovery, because I needed to hear it from him directly. He was a patient man. He understood what I was asking for. He said, "We came around the bend in the creek, and there he was, sitting on a flat rock in the middle of the water, his feet in the creek, looking downstream. He didn't hear us at first. We were upwind." I said, "What was he doing?" Dale said, "Just sitting, not doing anything, like he was waiting for a bus." He paused. "I don't mean that to sound dismissive. I just mean he was calm. I've found people in the backcountry before who were lost or in trouble. They look a certain way. He didn't look that way." I said, "What way did he look?" Dale said, "Settled, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be." I said, "Did he seem like he'd been alone for 3 days?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "He seemed a little tired, a little thirsty, but not the way you'd expect. I've seen dehydration before. What he had was mild, and there were no significant tears in his clothes, no visible scrapes on his arms and legs." Kevin noticed it too. We talked about it afterward. I said, "What did you make of it?" He said, "I made nothing of it at the time. I was focused on getting him out. Afterward, I kept thinking about it. A kid who's been in the wilderness for 3 days should show it. He didn't show it much." He said, "I asked him if he was okay, and he said yes. I asked him if he was hungry, and he said a little. I asked him if he knew where he was, and he said no. He said, 'Do you know where the camp is?' And I said we'd get him home, and he said, 'Okay.'" Dale was quiet. He said one more thing, before we started moving. He looked back downstream in the direction he'd been looking when we found him, and he said, you'd come." I said, "He?" Dale said, "I asked him who. He said something about a man who'd been with him. And then he got up and came with us, and didn't say much else about it. He said, 'I've been on search and rescue operations as a volunteer for 15 years. I've found a few people. I've never found anyone who was waiting, who seemed to know someone was coming.'" He said, "Your boy seemed to know, whatever he'd been through, whatever those 3 days were." He didn't say anything else. I said thank you. He said he hoped I got some answers. I haven't. The medical examination took 2 days. The attending physician specialized in pediatric wilderness medicine and had treated a significant number of search and rescue recovery cases. She was thorough, and she was honest. She said, "He is in remarkably good condition for a child who spent 72 hours in wilderness terrain in July." I said, "What does remarkably good mean specifically?" She said, "Mild dehydration, now resolved. No hypothermia. No significant skin breakdown from the terrain. No injuries to his feet or lower legs consistent with travel through rough wilderness terrain." I said, "Should there be?" She said, A 7-year-old moving 12.5 miles through that terrain on his own over 72 hours? Yes, we would expect at minimum significant blister formation, abrasion on the lower legs from brush contact, possible muscle fatigue indicators, and caloric depletion consistent with sustained physical exertion. She paused. She said, "His feet show wear consistent with normal activity. His legs show no significant abrasion. His caloric state is consistent with perhaps one skipped meal, not 3 days without food." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means either he did not travel 12.5 miles through that terrain on his own, or something about the circumstances of his travel prevented the physical markers I would expect to see." She said it carefully. She was a careful woman. I said, "Or someone carried him." She said, "That's one interpretation the evidence is consistent with." She said, "I can't confirm that. I can't confirm anything beyond what the physical examination shows." I said, "And what does it show?" She said, "A 7-year-old boy who should look like he's been lost in the wilderness for 3 days and doesn't." They interviewed Marcus on day 3, after he'd slept and eaten and been examined. The interviews were done by a child psychologist on staff, with me present. Catherine waited outside. She said she couldn't be in the room for it. I understood. The psychologist was patient and indirect, asking questions sideways rather than head-on, the way you approach something fragile. She asked Marcus about the camping trip. He described Friday evening in detail, the salamander, the field guide, the oatmeal. His memory of Friday was clear and specific. She asked about Saturday morning. He said he remembered being at the edge of camp looking for another salamander in the grass. She asked what happened next. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think someone was there." She asked who. He said, "I'm not sure. A man, maybe. I think he was in the trees." She asked what the man looked like. Marcus thought about it. He said, "I don't really remember. He was in the shade. I couldn't see him very well." She asked what happened when Marcus saw him. Marcus said, "He knew my name. I remember that clearly. He said something. I think it was that I shouldn't worry, that I wasn't lost, something like that. I can't remember the exact words." She asked what Marcus did. He said, "I went with him." She asked why. He thought about it. He said, "He knew my name. And he didn't feel scary." That's what I remember. He didn't feel scary. He seemed like he knew where he was going. She asked where they went. He said, "We walked. A long time, I think. He carried me when I got tired. I remember that." She asked what the man said while they were walking. Marcus was quiet for a while. He said, "I don't remember much. I remember him saying something about watching where I was stepping, and something about a creek. I don't know if I'm remembering it right. It was a long time ago." She asked, "Did you rest?" Marcus said, "I slept. I don't know where. On the ground somewhere, I think. I don't know how long. He was there when I woke up." She asked, "And then?" Marcus said, "And then I was at the creek, the one the men found me at, and he wasn't there anymore." She asked when the man left. Marcus thought for a long time. He said, "I'm not sure he left. I think I fell asleep, and when I woke up he just wasn't there. I don't remember him going." She asked, "Were you scared when he wasn't there?" Marcus said, "No. I think he told me to wait by the creek. I remember waiting. I think he said someone would come." She asked, "Did he say anything else you remember?" Marcus was quiet. He said, He knew about the salamander. I don't know how. I hadn't told him. Or maybe I did tell him and I don't remember. But I have this feeling that he knew. A pause. I remember him saying something about how they can grow back their legs. I might be mixing things up. The room was very quiet. The psychologist asked a few more questions. Marcus's memory of the man was fragmentary. He could not describe the man's face, his clothing, his approximate age. He said he thought the man was tall, but he wasn't sure. He said the man had a quiet voice, but he couldn't describe it specifically. He said, "I remember feeling safe, more than I remember anything else about him." I know that sounds strange. After the session, the psychologist spoke to me privately. She said, "Children Marcus's age can confabulate, construct narrative memories to fill gaps in recalled experience. Stress, sleep deprivation, and fear can produce vivid memories that the child fully believes." I said, "You think he imagined it?" She said, "I think his experience was real to him. Whether there was a physical person with him is something I can't determine from the interview alone." I said, "He was 12.5 miles from camp." She said, "Yes." I said, "Through terrain the tracking specialist said was physically impossible for him to cross alone." She said, "Yes." I said, "So either he crossed impossible terrain alone, or someone helped him." She said, "Those are the two possibilities the evidence supports." I said, "And a 7-year-old confabulating a helpful stranger doesn't explain how he crossed the terrain." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "No, it doesn't." The full examination included input from a pediatric neurologist and the child psychologist. When Marcus was asked to draw a map of where he had gone, the psychologist's approach, indirect, non-pressuring, he took the pencil and paper and drew for several minutes. He drew trees, a creek, a campsite. He drew a line from the campsite going south, which was already notable. He drew elevation marks along the line, the way a child who has been taught to read topographic maps understands elevation. I had taught him to read topographic maps the previous spring. The line he drew went south and slightly west. It avoided the ridgeline, went around it, which is the 42-mile route the wilderness specialist had described as the only theoretically possible path. Marcus had never seen a map of the area. We had not discussed the terrain between the campsite and the recovery location with him. He drew the avoidance route. The psychologist showed the drawing to the wilderness specialist. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "This is the correct route." She said, "The child drew this." He said, "The child drew this correctly." He said, "An adult who knows this terrain knows this route. I can't explain how a 7-year-old drew it." He said, "Someone who knew this terrain moved this child. That's the most direct explanation I can offer. But I'm aware that the investigation found no evidence of who that someone was." He would not say more than that. The drawing is in the case file. Marcus signed a release when he turned 18 to allow it to be included in any account the family chose to make public. It shows a line from a campsite, south and west, around a ridgeline, through 3 drainages, to a creek. Drawn by a 7-year-old who had never seen the terrain. Drawn the way someone draws a route they have traveled. The investigation that followed the recovery was thorough. I want to be precise about that because I don't want to suggest the authorities were careless or dismissive. They were neither. Federal and state law enforcement were involved. The National Forest Law Enforcement coordinated with the regional agencies. They investigated every registered sex offender within 200 miles. They interviewed every permitted hunter and outfitter operating in the wilderness that summer. They reviewed every access point between the campsite and the recovery location for vehicle traffic. They searched for any evidence of another person's presence along the possible route. They found nothing. No suspect, no unidentified footprints, no camps, no fire rings, no indication that any other person had been in the drainage where Marcus was recovered within the relevant time frame. The lead investigator, a state police detective named Gavin Reese, called me at the 6-month mark. He said, "We have no suspect, no physical evidence of another person, no identified individual who could have moved your son from point A to point B. We have your son's statement, which describes a person but cannot provide identifiable information. We have a physical situation that our investigators cannot explain through conventional means." I said, "Conventional means." He said, "Yes." I said, "What does that leave?" He said, "It leaves a case with no resolution, Mr. Voss. I'm sorry. We're not closing it. But I want you to know where we are." I knew where they were. I had known where they were since Diane Chu called me from the recovery location. At the 8-month mark, I was allowed to review the compiled case record, statements, forensic reports, medical records with Marcus's authorization, search logs, terrain assessments. I spent 2 days in a conference room with a copy of the file and a legal pad. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit had submitted an assessment of the case. The relevant section read, "Subject's statement describes an individual with knowledge of the subject's name and a defined purpose related to the search operation. The described behavior, leading subject to a specific recovery location, maintaining subject's physical condition, communicating awareness of the search, is inconsistent with opportunistic or predatory intent. No known behavioral profile accounts for the described interaction and the subsequent absence of physical evidence. No known behavioral profile." The forensic botanist who examined Marcus's clothing found plant material consistent with the drainage where he was recovered and with the campsite. She found no plant material from the terrain between those 2 points. The ridgeline flora, the specific species of the crossing drainages. She filed it as inconclusive. The absence of plant material doesn't prove absence of travel. It's possible to move through terrain and not collect specific plant material. It's possible. Diane Chu submitted a supplementary report at the 3-month mark. The relevant passage. "In my 20 years of tracking experience, the absence of ground sign in this case is the most significant anomaly I have encountered. Ground sign is not optional. Every living body moving through terrain displaces material. Every step compresses, displaces, or transfers something. The only conditions under which sign is completely absent are: 1. The subject did not travel through the terrain in question. 2. The subject was transported through the terrain by means that did not include ground contact. Or 3. The sign was deliberately and expertly concealed after the fact." Option 1 is contradicted by the recovery location. Option 3 would require a level of tracking expertise that is extraordinarily rare and would itself leave sign. Option 2. I'm not prepared to speculate further on option 2. She stopped there. In a 20-page report, she stopped at option 2. I read that passage several times in the conference room. Option 2. She wasn't prepared to speculate. Neither am I. But I think about it. Marcus did not talk about the man frequently. He mentioned him occasionally in the months after the recovery, always in the same fragmentary way. The man knew his name. The man carried him. Something about the salamander. Once, about 8 months after the recovery, Marcus said something that I have thought about many times since. We were driving home from school. He was looking out the window at a field, and he said, without preamble, "I've been thinking about what he said. In the forest." I said, "The man?" He said, "Yeah. I think he said something about making sure I got found. I can't remember the exact words. But there was something about it being his job. That's the word I remember." I said, "His job?" Marcus said, "That's the word that stuck. I might be wrong about the context, but I remember that word." He kept looking out the window. I said, "What do you think he meant?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't know." But I believed him. He didn't say anything else about it. I didn't push. I've thought about that word every day since. Job. The terrain between our campsite and the recovery location has been analyzed by 3 separate wilderness experts over the 8 years since. I contacted them myself at different times with the case records and the GPS coordinates of both points. All 3 gave me essentially the same assessment. A wilderness guide with 30 years in the area said, "In July, with snowmelt feeding the drainages, that river section is not crossable by an adult without a boat or technical swimming ability. It is certainly not crossable by a 7-year-old. There is no ford within miles of the logical crossing point." A physical geographer who had done research in the area said, "The ridgeline between those 2 coordinates tops out at 8,900 feet. In July, there is still snow on the northern faces. The approach from the north is Class 3, scrambling at minimum. No 7-year-old crosses that ridgeline without technical equipment and adult guidance." A wilderness SAR specialist who had worked the region for 12 years said, "The only route between those 2 points that a child could theoretically navigate avoids the ridgeline and goes around it to the east. That route is approximately 42 miles of actual ground distance in 72 hours, averaging a mile an hour with rest, which is aggressive for a child. You cover 72 miles. A 42-mile route is theoretically possible on time alone." He paused. He said, "But that route crosses 3 drainages and gains and loses 5,000 feet of total elevation. I've hiked it. It took me 4 days, and I'm in good physical condition. Marcus's medical indicators when he was recovered don't support a 42-mile hike." I said, "So there's no route that works." He said, "There's no route that works given the medical evidence. If someone carried him, the weight distribution changes the calculation. But no one was identified who could have done that." He said, "Someone carrying 60 pounds over that terrain, 42 miles, in 72 hours. That's an extraordinary physical performance." I said, "But possible." He said, "Theoretically, I can't rule it out mathematically." He was quiet. He said, "But there would be evidence. That kind of travel leaves ground sign. Diane Chu found nothing." I said, "I know." He said, "I don't have an answer for you. I'm sorry." That's what they all said. "I'm sorry." Marcus is 15 now. He is, by any measure, fine. He is a good student with a particular interest in biology, and an ongoing fascination with amphibians that dates to a salamander he found under a rock at a creek crossing when he was 7. He has friends, he plays soccer, he reads constantly. He and Catherine have a relationship built partly on the fact that she was there when he disappeared, and partly on something harder to name, some quality of attention she gives him that I think comes from having spent 62 hours not knowing if he was alive. He remembers the man in the forest. I've asked him about it twice in the past 3 years. Careful not to push. Careful not to build a structure around something fragile. Both times he said essentially the same thing. The memory is clear in the way a dream is clear, vivid and specific, and somehow also out of focus. He remembers the man's presence more than any physical detail. He remembers feeling safe. He said once, "I know it sounds strange, but I was never scared. Not once. Normally, I'm scared of the dark." He is. He still sleeps with a light on, he said. But in the forest, with him, I wasn't scared at all. I asked, "Why not?" He thought about it for a while. He said, "I think because he wasn't scared. And he seemed to know where we were going. When someone knows where they're going, you're not scared." A pause. "That's how I remember it anyway. I was 7. I don't know how much of that is memory, and how much is something I've built up over time." I said, "Do you think he was real?" He looked at me for a long time. He said, "I know I got from the camp to the creek somehow. Something got me there." He paused. He said, "I think it was him." There is one more thing Marcus told me. He was 13, 2 years before I'm writing this. We were driving back from a camping trip, not the Granite Divide. We've never gone back there, but a lake in the Cascades, a gentler terrain, a trip that felt safe enough to try. He had spent an afternoon on the water in a kayak, and he was tired and quiet in the car. He said, without looking at me, "I've been thinking about him again." I said, "The man from the forest?" He said, "Yes." I waited. He said, "I've been trying to figure out what I actually remember versus what I think I remember, because it was a long time ago and I was 7. I said, "What do you actually remember?" He thought for a while. He said, "I remember his hand. At some point he reached back and took my hand. I think we were going over something, a rock or a root, I'm not sure. And his hand was cold. I'm fairly certain about that. His hand was cold." He paused. He said, "And I remember when I woke up at the creek, there was no one there. But I had the feeling that the ground next to me had been pressed down, like someone had been sitting there." He paused. "I don't know if that's a real memory or something I've added over the years. I honestly can't tell," he said. "I didn't tell the doctors about that part." I said, "Why are you telling me now?" He thought about it. He said, "Because you're writing it down, and I think it should be in there, even if I'm not sure it's right." Another pause. "Whatever he was there while I slept. I believe that. I think that matters. I think it does too, even if I can't be certain of what it means. The night before they found him was the worst. Not the first night. The first night had urgency, had motion, had the feeling of things being done. Teams in the field, dogs working, helicopters in the air. Something happening. The third night had none of that. By the third night, the search had been running for 60 hours. The terrain north and east of camp had been covered at what the incident commander called saturation density. Every reasonable extension of Marcus's possible movement had been searched. The thermal flights had found nothing warm that wasn't already accounted for. The witness account from Gerald Torino had been investigated, and the terrain south of camp had been added to the grid. But south was late, and the search south was thinner because all the evidence had pointed north. On the third night, Steve Arkell sat with me and Catherine and told us where they were. He said, "We are not stopping the search. I want to be clear about that. But I want you to understand what the search record shows at this point." Catherine said, "Tell us," he said. 72 hours, comprehensive coverage of the primary search zone. No physical evidence of your son's presence beyond the initial campsite and the 30-yard scent endpoint. No sighting, no secondary evidence, no indication of direction. He said, "In cases of this type, at this stage, the statistical probability of a living recovery decreases significantly." Catherine said, "What are you telling us?" He said, "I'm telling you we are not stopping. But I want you to be prepared." Catherine said, "We are not prepared for that." He said, "I know." He left us alone. Catherine and I sat in the car. We didn't speak for a long time. At some point she said, "He's alive. I know he's alive." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know how I know. I just know." I said, "I know." We sat in the dark with the forest at the end of the access road and the search team somewhere in there doing what they could. And we waited. At 7:22 the next morning, Steve Arkell's radio produced a transmission. He listened. He looked at his radio for a moment. He turned and found us. He said, "They found him." I've wondered in the years since what Catherine's certainty on that third night meant. Whether she was simply refusing to accept an alternative, the way parents do, or whether she was accessing something real. She says she doesn't know either. She says, "I just knew. Don't ask me how." Marcus says he knew too. He says on the third night, sitting by the creek, he had a feeling that morning was coming, and someone was coming with it. He says he thinks the man told him. I want to be careful about how I present that. Marcus was 7. He has been reconstructing those memories for 8 years. The certainty he expresses may be the certainty of a narrative he has built, rather than the certainty of memory. He would be the first to acknowledge that. He has acknowledged it in those same conversations. But 3 people, in 3 separate locations, held the same expectation that night. I'm a geography teacher. I don't have a framework for that. But I think about it. I went back to the campsite 4 years after the recovery. Marcus was 11. He did not come with me. Catherine did not come. I went alone on a Thursday in August, parking at the same trailhead, hiking the same 4.2 miles to the same established site above the river drainage. The campsite was occupied. 2 women on a solo trip, packing out on the day I arrived. They gave me the site as they left. I set up my tent in the place I remembered, by the fire ring, facing the same tree line. I walked to the edge of camp where Marcus had been crouching in the grass that Saturday morning. The grass was the same grass. The tree line was the same tree line. The forest beyond it ran north for miles and then opened into drainages and ridge lines, and eventually, somewhere I couldn't see and couldn't reach in a day, the creek where the hunters had found my son. 12.5 miles. South, through terrain 3 experts had told me was impassable for a 7-year-old. I stood at the camp edge for a long time. I thought about what Marcus had said. Someone who seemed to know where they were going. I thought about the fragmentary memory, the man in the shade, the quiet voice. He knew my name. He carried me when I got tired. Something about the salamander. Something about a job. I thought about the psychologist saying that confabulation can produce vivid false memories, and then saying that confabulation doesn't explain how he crossed the terrain. I thought about Diane Chu saying physically impossible and meaning it. I walked north into the timber, 30 yards to the place where the dogs had lost the scent. I stood there. The forest stood with me. Pine and fir and the particular silence of late summer wilderness, where everything has already done its growing, and the year is resting before it falls. I looked at the ground. I thought about a man standing in this same space, in the shade, so Marcus couldn't see his face clearly, saying something about not being lost. I thought about the fact that Marcus was, in fact, not lost after that point. Whatever had happened next, Marcus had ended up found, alive at a creek, 12.5 miles away, waiting calmly for someone to come. He said it was his job. I don't have a framework for that. I'm a geography teacher. I understand terrain. I understand distance and elevation, and the physics of moving a body through space. I understand what 12.5 miles of wilderness actually means when you put it on a map. I also understand that my son is alive, and that something got him from point A to point B in 72 hours. And that thing has not been identified, and the physical evidence has not explained it. And my son's memory of it is vivid and specific, and 30 years of wilderness experience among the experts who reviewed it has not been able to dismiss it. I stood in the timber north of the campsite for a while. Then I walked back to camp. I made dinner. I built a fire. I sat in a camp chair and watched the flames, and thought about Marcus at 7, sitting in his small chair with a headlamp and a field guide, telling me that salamanders could regenerate lost limbs. I thought that was the right word for what had happened. Regenerate. Something had been taken from us of this forest. Not Marcus. We had gotten Marcus back, but something else. Something about the relationship between the world as I understood it and the world as it apparently is. That relationship had been damaged here, in this campsite, in the 62 hours Marcus was gone. I have been trying to grow it back ever since. I am not certain it grows back entirely. The case is still open. Detective Gavin Reese retired 2 years ago. The case was transferred. The new investigator called me once, a courtesy call, confirming the transfer and the ongoing open status. There is nothing new. There's been nothing new for 8 years. Marcus's statement is in the file. The fragmentary memory. The man who knew his name. The man who carried him. The man who, in whatever form Marcus's memory has preserved it, said something about making sure he got found. That statement is in the file alongside the tracking specialist's report finding no trail, alongside the medical examiner's findings, noting the absence of expected injury, alongside the terrain assessments stating that the route was physically impossible, alongside 3 days of search records documenting comprehensive coverage of the area north of camp, while Marcus was south. All of it in a file in an office somewhere in Idaho. All of it unresolved. On the night I stayed at the campsite alone, I woke at some point in the dark to a sound from the direction of the tree line. I don't know what it was. Something moving, maybe. Or the forest settling. the way forests do at night, in the particular quiet of places that haven't been disturbed. I lay still and listened. Nothing followed. No second sound. I stayed still for a while, and then I went back to sleep. I mention it because it happened. I don't know what to make of it. A bird. A deer at the perimeter. Wind across the treetops. In wilderness terrain, at night, sounds come and go without explanation. That's not unusual. I know that. In the morning, I packed up and walked out. At the tree line north of camp, where the 30-yard mark had been, I stopped for a moment and looked into the timber. Ordinary forest. Pine, fir, duff, shadow. I turned south and started down the trail. About 100 yards along, I paused and looked back at the campsite. I do this sometimes without knowing why. A geography teacher's habit of orienting, checking position. Through the trees, I could see the fire ring and the cleared ground and the camp chair I had left beside the fire ring. It looked to me like it was facing north, toward the tree line. I had left it facing the fire ring. I thought. Memory, in retrospect, is not always reliable, and I had been breaking camp while thinking about other things. I may have turned it without noticing. I looked at it for a while. Then I turned south and walked out. I have not gone back. Marcus is 15. He is healthy. He is here. Whether the chair was turned, or whether I simply remembered it wrong, I don't know. Whether the sound in the night was anything more than a forest being a forest, I don't know. Whether Marcus's memory of the man in the shade is a real recollection, a confabulated narrative, or something that cannot be cleanly categorized as either, I don't know. What I know is this. My son was in the wilderness for 72 hours and he came home. Something got him from where he disappeared to where he was found. No investigation across 8 years has identified what that something was. The case is still open. My son is 15. He is here. For now, that is enough. This story is a work of fiction inspired by real wilderness disappearance cases, search and rescue investigations, and accounts of children found in unexpected circumstances.